Ask almost anyone in China, and they will tell you the North and the South are two different worlds. In the North, people eat wheat, noodles, dumplings, thick steamed bread. In the South, it is rice in 1,000 forms. The North speaks Mandarin. The South speaks languages a Northerner cannot follow at all: Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, Wu. The stereotypes are old, and the people who hold them are certain. Northerners, taller and blunter, built for cold winters. Southerners, smaller and quicker, made for heat and water. Two peoples, the story goes, who happen to share a name. So a team of geneticists asked a question that sounds almost too obvious to study. If you take the DNA of a northern Han and a southern Han and you read them side by side, how different would they really be? It feels like it should have an easy answer. Everyone can see the divide. You can taste it. You can hear it. You can watch it walk down a street. Surely the genome would draw the same hard line the map does. But when the data came back, the line was not where anyone expected. It was not exactly a line at all. This is the story of what scientists found when they put Northern and Southern Han DNA head-to-head. Across more than 11,000 genomes, several landmark studies, and 17 centuries of one of the largest migrations in recorded history. Stay to the end, and you will understand something about us and them that most people get backwards. Not only about China, but about how any people becomes a people. If the deep history hiding inside ordinary places is your kind of thing, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. To understand why the answer surprised them, we first need to understand what DNA can and cannot tell you about a group of people. Start with a thing that is easy to forget. Every human being alive descends from the same small population that lived in Africa a little over 200,000 years ago. Compare any two people on Earth from any two continents, and their DNA is something like 99.9% identical. Layered on top of that shared inheritance are a few faint traces of other human kinds. Small percentages of Neanderthal ancestry in people outside Africa, a little Denisovan in parts of Asia and the Pacific. But the headline never changes. The differences between human groups are real, and they live in that last sliver of a percent. Within that sliver, ancestry does not sort into neat boxes. It runs in gradients. Move across a landscape, village to village, valley to valley, and the frequencies of genetic variance shift a little at each step, smoothly, with no clean break in between. Geneticists call that a cline. It is the rule, not the exception, almost everywhere humans have lived near each other for a long time. And when scientists measure how different two populations are, they are not asking whether you could pick one person out of a crowd. They are measuring something subtler: how much of the total genetic variation sits between the groups, rather than within them. For most human populations, that between-group number is strikingly small. The great majority of the variation is inside every group, shared across all of them. Hold on to that idea, a gradient, not a border, because it turns out to be the whole story. The honest picture of the Han North and South is not a line on a map, it is a web. And the web is what the data kept insisting on, no matter how the question was asked. And on the surface, the case for two peoples is strong. The languages alone almost make it. What gets called a Southern dialect is usually nothing of the kind. Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, Wu are separate tongues, as far apart from Mandarin and from one another as French is from Spanish. A man from Guangzhou and a man from Beijing, with no shared schooling between them, cannot follow a word the other says. And the South was walled off by land as much as by speech. The Nanling Mountains run east to west across southern China like a closed door, and for long centuries they kept the North's people and the North's genes on the far side. If any population had earned the right to split clean in two, it was this one. Which is exactly what makes the genetics so strange. Everything above the skin says divide. The data, when it finally came, kept saying something else. The first serious look came in 2009. Chen and colleagues, publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics, did something that had not really been done at that scale before. They took more than 350,000 genetic markers, read them across more than 6,000 Han Chinese, and this is the clever part, they recruited those people by where their families actually came from. 10 provinces mapped onto the genome. Their reason for doing it was almost mundane. Population structure is a nuisance in medical genetics. If a group is secretly subdivided, it can throw off the search for disease genes, throwing up false signals. So they set out to chart that hidden structure and clear it away. By the usual assumption, you might have expected a messy cloud. What they got instead was almost eerily clean. When they let the math arrange people purely by their DNA, the arrangement that fell out was a single axis, north to south. One dimension. People's genetics lined up with their geography so tightly that you could place someone on a map of China fairly well from their genome alone. So the divide is real. That has to be said plainly because the honest version of this story does not pretend the North and the South are identical. They are not. The structure is there, and the data found it on the first try. But notice what kind of structure it is. Not two clusters with a gap between them. A gradient, one continuous slope from north to south, every region shading into the next. The mechanism behind it has a quiet name: isolation by distance. People tend to marry people who live near them. Do that for enough centuries, and the genome slowly takes on the shape of the land. Nearby places end up similar. Far places end up a little less so. A slope, not a wall. There was one telling exception. The big cities, Beijing, Shanghai, even the overseas Chinese community in Singapore, did not sit neatly on the slope. They were smeared, pulled out of place. The reason is plain once you see it. Modern cities are full of people from everywhere. The gradient is the old map. The cities are the new one, being drawn on top of it in real time. A second team that same year, led by Xu and colleagues in the same journal, pressed on the texture of it. When they dissected the Han population more finely, the clusters that emerged were not two. They were three, roughly. A northern Han, a southern Han, and a central Han sitting in between, blending into both. That central group matters more than it sounds. A true border would have no middle. The fact that there is a recognizable in-between, a smear where the two ends overlap, is the gradient showing itself again. It is the web, not the line. The closer you look, the more any hard edge dissolves into a continuous spread. Then, in 2018, came the study this whole question really rests on. Charleston Chiang and a team spread across several universities published in Molecular Biology and Evolution the most detailed genetic map of the Han Chinese ever assembled. The scale is hard to picture. 11,670 people, their genomes sequenced. More than 25 million genetic variants cataloged, over 500,000 of them never recorded anywhere before. There is a quiet irony in where those genomes came from. They were gathered originally for a study of major depression. 11,000 women, sequenced for an entirely medical purpose. The Han Chinese, the largest ethnic group on the planet, had until then been thinly studied in genetics, the way most non-European populations have been. One depression study ended up producing the clearest portrait of them yet. With that much resolution, the team confirmed the north-south cline everyone had already seen. Then they found something new underneath it, a fainter east-to-west gradient, structure no earlier study had had the power to detect. And the whole pattern, north-south and east-west together, fit one simple model: isolation by distance again. The genome of the Han, mapped in fine detail, was essentially a map of China itself. So here is the moment the question turns. Because the headline of that 2018 study was not the structure. It was the size of it. Despite the cline, despite the clean north-south slope, the new east-west axis, the recognizable regional shading, the Han Chinese, taken as a whole, showed remarkably low overall differentiation. As a single population, one of the largest on Earth, they are among the least internally divided that scientists have measured at this scale. The structure is real. The structure is also shallow. The line you can draw is faint, and the more people you add to the picture, the fainter it gets. To say it in human terms, the genetic distance from the far north of the Han to the far south is the kind of subtle, close-range structure geneticists expect to find within a single region of a single country, not the deep cleft the phrase two peoples conjures. The whole span of the world's largest ethnic group, from Heilongjiang in the frozen northeast to Hainan in the tropical south, is a remarkably short genetic walk. That the team could see this at all came down to resolution. 25 million variants is an enormous jump on what came before. Earlier studies worked with a few 100,000 markers, where Chiang's catalog was deep enough to pick up the faint things. That is how the east-west axis surfaced for the first time. It even caught the country's seams. The northeast, the old Manchuria, which was not always under the control of Han dynasties, carries a slightly different signal, the trace of a frontier that changed hands across history. Which raises the obvious question. If people really did stay near home for centuries, if isolation by distance was busy drawing a gradient, then why is the gradient so weak? What kept the North and the South from drifting apart into genuinely separate peoples? The answer is not in a laboratory. It is in 1,700 years of history. The Han did not begin spread across China. They began in one place, the Central Plain, the basin of the Yellow River in the north. The South, for long stretches of early history, was somebody else's home. The lands below the mountains were frontier, much of it malarial, sparsely held. What carried the North into the South was not a slow trickle. It was catastrophe, 3 times over. The first wave broke around the year 311, when the Western Jin dynasty collapsed and its capital at Luoyang was sacked. Historians call it the disaster of Yongjia. Something close to 900,000 people, aristocrats, officials, the imperial house, and the ordinary families swept along with them, fled south of the Yangtze and built a new capital where Nanjing stands today. The second wave came more than 4 centuries later. In 755, the An Lushan rebellion tore the Tang dynasty open. The figures from that period are staggering, even allowing for the chaos in the records. A census of nearly 53 million before the revolt, and under 17 million after. Much of that gap is administrative collapse rather than death. But a great deal of it is people, again, pouring south to escape the north. The third wave fell in 1127, when the Jingkang incident ended the northern Song and the dynasty refounded itself in the south, at Hangzhou. Taken together, these 3 great migrations moved well over 6 million people out of the north and into the south. And they did not arrive into empty country. The refugees of Yongjia poured into the rich lower Yangtze, the delta region the Chinese call Jiangnan. The Tang refugees scattered west towards Sichuan and down to the southeastern coast. The Song court carried an entire capital, its scholars, its craftsmen, its court, south to Hangzhou. Every wave settled among southerners who were already there and stayed and married in. No wave wiped the slate clean. Each one wrote over a south that already had people on it. That repeated layering is the Klein itself. The north pressed into the south so many times that the two could no longer be fully told apart. Now set that against the genetics. Each of those waves carried northern DNA into southern China and mixed it with the people already living there. Do that again and again for 1,000 years, and you get precisely what Chiang's team measured. A real north-south difference, because the gradient never fully erased, sitting on top of low overall differentiation, because the gene flow never stopped. The Klein is the faded record of the migrations. The shallowness of the Klein is the migrations themselves, refusing to let the two ends pull apart. You can see the same truth in the southern groups those migrations created. The Cantonese, the Hakka, the Hoklo of the Min-speaking coast, the Wu speakers of the lower Yangtze. each one a distinct community, with its own language, its own memory, its own sense of itself. And each one, when you trace it back, is northern migrants layered onto the southern peoples who were already there. The group's historians call the Bai Yue, gradually woven in, until the join disappeared. That is what Southern Han actually means at the level of DNA, not a separate root. Two threads of one web, twisted together over centuries until you cannot find the seam. Distinct, yes. Separate, no. The very groups people point to as proof of a divided South are themselves the clearest evidence of the mixing. The Hakka carry the whole story in their name. Hakka means literally guest families, the guests. When these northern migrants arrived in the South, the people already settled there, who were themselves the descendants of earlier northern arrivals, marked the newcomers as outsiders, guests. The name held for 1,000 years. They built great walled roundhouses, kept their own speech, married among themselves, and remembered, in song, in genealogy, that they had come down from the north. A people defined entirely by a migration, and treated as foreign by neighbors who had made the very same journey a few centuries before them. If you wanted one image for how the Han North and South were really made, it might be that. Everyone a guest in the end. Everyone from somewhere further up the river. There is even a long-running scientific argument folded into this, whether Han culture spread mainly by people moving, or mainly by ideas and language moving while populations stayed put. Demic diffusion against cultural diffusion. The DNA comes down mostly on the side of people. Real bodies walking south, marrying in, generation after generation. The web has threads you can name, and they were carried by feet. And the web does not stop at the edges of the Han. In 2009, the HUGO Pan-Asian SNP consortium, dozens of laboratories across 10 countries, published in the journal Science the broadest genetic survey of Asia attempted up to that point. Nearly 2,000 people, 73 populations, from India to Japan to the Philippines. What they found was that ancestry across the entire continent tracks two things: language and geography, and that gene flow between neighboring populations is everywhere, prevalent, ordinary. There were no walls. The Han north-south cline, seen from that height, is simply one ripple in a gradient that runs the length of a continent. Zoom out far enough, and every people turns out to have blurred edges, shading quietly into its neighbors. The survey reached deeper still, into the continent's first peopling, a single major movement of people into Asia long ago, and then a slow spread northward, leaving Southeast Asia and East Asia closely related at the root. Long before any dynasty, before there was even an idea of a North or a South Han, the ancestors of all of them were already one wandering population, splitting and rejoining as they went. The web is older than the names we have given its threads. So gather what the three Han studies actually say, side by side, the way the question first asked. Chen, in 2009, found the north-south structure is real and tracks geography almost perfectly. Xu, the same year, found it has a soft middle, a central Han blending both ends. Chiang, in 2018, with the largest sample of all, confirmed the cline and then delivered the turn. That for all its visible structure, the Han Chinese are one of the least internally differentiated large populations on record. None of that erases the noodles and the rice, the Mandarin and the Cantonese, the long memory of a divided land. Those differences are real, and they matter. They are culture, language, place, the texture of an actual life. But they are not two bloodlines meeting at a border. They are two ends of one long, continuous, much-traveled gradient, kept from ever splitting by 1,000 years of people walking south. Think about what that means for a moment. For 17 centuries, northern China was struck by some of the worst upheavals any society has endured. The fall of dynasties, the sacking of capitals, famine, invasion, the kind of collapse that empties whole provinces off the map. Every time, people moved. And every time they moved, they carried the north into the south and mixed it back in. You might expect that to fracture a population, to break it into pieces, each drifting off on its own, hardening over time into separate peoples with separate roots. The opposite happened. The catastrophes did not divide the Han. They bound the Han together. Each disaster pulled a thread the length of the country, nodding north to south one more time. The very thing that should have torn them apart is the thing that kept them one. That is the finding, stated as plainly as the evidence allows. A real divide. A shallow one. A people visibly distinct from north to south, and still, underneath all of it, deeply and measurably one. It is worth being careful about what this does and does not mean, because questions shaped like this one get pulled in directions the data never goes. It does not mean that one end of the gradient is older, or purer, or more truly Han than the other. There is no pure end. The north is migrants settled on top of earlier migrants. The south is those northern migrants braided into southern natives. Purity was never on the table. It is not a thing a genome contains. What a genome contains is the record of people meeting people over and over, until the question of who was really from where stops having a clean answer. And it does not mean the differences are nothing. It means they are the right size. The line between north and south is not a wall, and never was. It is a smudge, the soft place where one part of a single continuous people shades into another, a web, not a line. That is not a smaller truth than two peoples. It is a larger one. If you have ever taken a DNA test and watched it return a broad Chinese or East Asian result that refused to break down any further, that is this same fact looking back at you from your own report. The reason the test struggles to split the Han into tidy regional slices is that, genetically, they barely are split. The web is too tightly woven for the line you were hoping to see. Because this is not, in the end, a story about China alone. It is how every people becomes a people, not from one pure source guarded against the world, but from waves of strangers arriving, mixing, staying, until the seams vanish, and their grandchildren cannot say where one thread ended and the next began. The Han are not unusual in this. They are only unusually well measured. What their DNA shows, across 11,000 genomes and 17 centuries of migration, is the ordinary, astonishing way human beings have always made one another. So the next time someone tells you the North and the South are two different worlds, you can agree with them, and then offer the better version. They are two ends of one bright, continuous thread, knotted tighter every single time history tried to cut it. A web, not a line. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There's a whole hidden history inside the places and peoples we think we already know, and we go looking for it every week.